when Pam Bondi accused the sitting federal judge of bending the law for political reasons. Most thought it was all talk until the judge quietly stepped aside, and the justice system started to panic. Bondi sat still in her office in Tallahassee, jaw clenched, watching the news on a muted screen. CNN had just broken the story. Judge James Boasburg issued a federal order halting the latest round of deportation flights to El Salvador. The anchor used words like controversial, humanitarian concern, and due process. Bondi didn't flinch. She picked up her pen, tapped it twice against her desk, and said quietly, "They're playing with fire." The case had been brewing for weeks. Venezuelan nationals, some accused of gang activity, others simply undocumented, were being held in ICE detention centers in South Texas. Homeland Security, under pressure to clean up loopholes, had fast-tracked their deportations. It was swift, brutal, and for many, irreversible. A plane was already on the tarmac in McAllen when Boasburg's order came through. The White House was furious, but this wasn't Bondi's first time in the middle of a legal knife fight. She'd built a reputation by going straight at political opponents with a smile on her face and enough legal firepower to blow up a courtroom. She wasn't intimidated by robes or titles. She made 2 calls, the first to her deputy, the second to Fox. Meanwhile, inside the courthouse in Washington, D.C., Judge Boasburg was calm. He'd seen the protests, the opinion pieces calling him a traitor, but this wasn't political, he told himself. The administration was skipping hearings, rushing people onto planes without giving them a chance to speak. That violated the law. Full stop. His clerk, a sharp 32-year-old named Lawrence E., stepped into his chambers. "They're saying the Attorney General's going to make a statement tonight." Boasburg didn't look up. "Let her. We'll do our job." But outside the court, things were turning ugly. Protesters had begun gathering at both ends of the spectrum. Some holding signs that read "Deport the criminals now," others with "Judges are not puppets." Cable hosts were already comparing Boasburg to other activist judges. His face was on the screen more than it had ever been in his life, and Pam Bondi was just getting started. That night on the Ingraham angle, Bondi went live, her voice calm but biting. She leaned in when Laura Ingraham asked if she believed the judge was acting within the law. "He's not acting like a judge," Bondi said. "He's acting like an unelected policymaker." She paused just long enough to let it sting. "And the American people are tired of it." Her words sent a jolt through social media. Hashtags like #FireBoasburg and #PamTheHummer trended within the hour. Senators started calling each other. Journalists flooded inboxes. Inside the Dodge, staffers were quiet. They knew what this meant. Bondi wasn't just speaking her mind, she was drawing a line. 2 days later, the Miami Herald published a leaked memo. It showed that some of the Venezuelan detainees had indeed been flagged as security risks. One had a history of involvement with a gang in Caracas, but others were political asylum seekers. Their files were incomplete. The memo hinted that the flights were rushed to meet a political deadline. That nuance? It didn't matter to the public anymore. Sides had already been chosen. Bondi's team released a follow-up statement that morning. Judge Boasburg's actions threatened the independence of our judicial system by allowing partisan influence to override legal protocol. That line was no accident. She was flipping the usual script, claiming that judicial independence wasn't just about judges doing what they wanted, it was about staying in their lane. Inside the Supreme Court chambers, John Roberts took a deep breath when he read the statement. He closed the file in front of him. This wasn't just a clash between 2 branches of government, it was about what Americans believe justice should look like. But Bondi wasn't done. She was building a case not just against Boasburg but against the entire system that shielded judges from accountability. 3 days after her Fox News appearance, Pam Bondi stood behind a podium outside the Department of Justice building in Washington, D.C. The sky was overcast, and the press pool was thicker than usual. Her team had scheduled a press conference at noon, a peak broadcast time. Cameras rolled. Reporters held their recorders up like they were catching wind. She didn't waste time. "Let me be clear," Bondi began, her voice steady, her gaze unwavering. "This isn't about one judge. It's about an erosion of discipline in our federal judiciary. The American people expect impartiality, not interference. The air went still. Reporters used to the usual soft edge, and these briefings felt something different in her tone. This was no press release, it was a warning. She pulled out a stack of documents, case summaries, internal communications, reports from field agents. One stamped with the ICE insignia described 3 Venezuelan nationals whose asylum claims had been bypassed due to insufficient risk classification review. That meant they'd been shipped out without proper protocol. Bondi used it to hit both sides, the judges for stopping everything and the agencies for not tightening their process. And then she dropped the line that made headlines: "I'm not afraid of judges who act like kings. I'm afraid of what happens when no one calls them out." In the hours that followed, Bondi was everywhere. Her words looped on CNN, MSNBC, and Fox, each giving it their own spin. On Twitter, her critics painted her as a wannabe autocrat. Her supporters called her fearless. By sunset, a viral TikTok of her speech was circulating with dramatic music and the caption, "Pam versus the system." In a bar in Sacramento, a middle-aged man named Curtis Caldwell sat glued to the screen. He wasn't the kind to care about politics, but something about Bondi struck a chord. "She talks like someone who's been fed up for a while," he muttered. His cousin across the booth raised an eyebrow. "Or someone who's gunning for higher office." But Curtis wasn't the only one watching. Inside the federal courthouse in Miami, Judge Lena Dorsey, one of Boasburg's colleagues, listened to the live stream in her chambers. She didn't agree with Boasburg's handling of the case, but Bondi's broadside made her nervous. "She's playing the long game," Dorsey told her clerk. "She's not just pushing back, she's trying to reshape the public's idea of what a judge is." Later that night, Bondi appeared on News Nation for an extended interview. It wasn't the Safe Network, it was a calculated movie-going where the audience was mixed, less tribal. She wore a navy blazer, no jewelry, hair tied back. The look was deliberate, serious, no nonsense. The interviewer, a young anchor named Trent Massey, didn't hold back. "Attorney General, some say you're undermining judicial independence, that you're making it personal. How do you respond?" Bondi smiled. "Just barely. I respect the judiciary, but respect isn't silence. If a judge puts personal beliefs ahead of federal law, they're no longer neutral, they're political." Is Judge Boasburg political? He made a political decision under the cover of legality. That's more dangerous than partisanship. It's betrayal in slow motion. The interview hit a nerve. Massey, after wrapping, texted his producer, "We're going to get heat for this." They did, but so did Bondi. The next morning, protesters lined the Dodge steps. Some held signs showing Bondi's face with duct tape over it, reading "Shut up or step down." Others wore shirts that read "Hold judges accountable." Bondi walked through them on her way to her SUV, unfazed, flanked by security. A reporter shouted, "Are you going to call for Boasburg's removal?" She didn't respond. She didn't have to. Her silence said everything. That evening, someone leaked a private Dodge memo suggesting Bondi's office had already drafted a complaint to the Judicial Conference about Boasburg's conduct. If true, it meant she wasn't just grandstanding, she was mobilizing to take him down through formal channels. Chief Justice Roberts read the leak on his tablet in silence. He scrolled, paused, and ran a hand through his hair. His clerk entered the room but didn't speak. Roberts didn't look up. He knew what came next. But while public support was growing, the opposition was getting louder. Civil rights groups issued a joint statement accusing Bondi of orchestrating a coordinated campaign to intimidate judges. The American Bar Association warned against weaponizing public opinion to undermine the rule of law. In D.C., protesters camped outside the federal courthouse not just with signs but with chants, "Hands off the bench and no courts, no justice." Bondi saw them on her drive home. Her security detail didn't say a word, but she noticed one of them shifting in his seat, watching the crowd too closely. She didn't speak either, but she knew what was coming next. Because the more the crowds grew, the more pressure landed on Roberts, and he was about to make a move no one saw coming. 3 days later, Pam Bondi walked into the Rayburn House office building with a leather briefcase and a plan to change everything. The Judiciary Oversight Subcommittee had called her to testify under oath. It was supposed to be a routine hearing, a polite grilling, a few sound bites, then out. But Bondi didn't come to play defense. She brought evidence. She was calm, measured, but you could feel it building under her voice, like a current you couldn't see until it hit. "I'm not here to attack the judiciary," she said early on. "I'm here because silence is complicity." The committee room was packed. Photographers lined the back wall. Journalists filled every seat. The chair, Congressman Gregory Yates from Oregon, leaned in as Bondi reached into her briefcase. She pulled out a set of redacted documents. "This," she said, tapping the stack, "is proof that Judge Boasburg's chambers engaged directly with advocacy groups while actively hearing a case related to asylum protocols. That's not interpretation of law. That's coordination, and that violates judicial ethics." The room shifted. Staffers started whispering. Someone in the back gasped, maybe out of shock, maybe for effect. But Bondi wasn't done. She turned to Yates. "And if this body doesn't investigate, you're setting a precedent that judges are beyond reproach even when they stop being judges and start being activists." Outside, the media frenzy erupted. The documents Bondi submitted were rally emails obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests. While they didn't prove wrongdoing outright, they suggested a troubling degree of familiarity between Boasburg's clerk and outside legal activists. CNN ran a banner, "Bondi drops bombshell on bench bias." Overnight, right-wing pundits called for Boasburg's resignation. Left-wing voices called the hearing a witch hunt. Twitter became a minefield. Every tweet was either a war cry or a warning. In Charleston, South Carolina, a high school civics teacher named Rita Mendoza watched the hearing clips from her phone during lunch break. She replayed one line twice, "Silence is complicity." She'd said something similar to her students earlier that week while discussing the Civil Rights Act. Now, she looked at Bondi and thought, is she right? Or is she just loud? That question wasn't just bouncing around classrooms. It was on talk radio, podcasts, PTA meetings, coffee shops. It had reached everyone from cab drivers to policy think tanks. And back in D.C., the pressure on Chief Justice Roberts had cracked open the walls. In an unannounced appearance, Roberts took the stage at a judicial ethics conference in St. Louis. It wasn't the speech on the schedule. He walked up quietly after a scheduled panel and asked for the mic. No teleprompter, just him in a very tired-looking suit. "The independence of the judiciary doesn't mean we operate without scrutiny," he said. "It means we answer to the Constitution and not to polls, not to headlines, and not to fear." He paused. "But we also answer to the people. And if their trust in us fades, it's not because they failed us, it's because we failed them." The room was silent. No applause, no coughing, just a quiet realization that something had shifted. Back in Washington, Bondi watched a clip of the speech from her office, alone. She didn't smile. She didn't say a word. But she picked up her phone and sent a text to her advisor. He blinked. The next morning, new protests erupted not just outside Boasburg's court but in front of the Supreme Court building itself. Two groups clashed on the marble steps, one side chanting "Protect the bench," the other yelling "Courts can't be kings." Capitol Police intervened. A few arrests were made. Boasburg, for his part, stayed silent. His office issued a one-sentence statement: "The judge remains committed to the impartial application of law." It was vague, but it didn't matter anymore. His name had become a symbol of everything broken out or everything brave, depending who you asked. Later that day, Roberts made an unprecedented request. He summoned Boasburg for a private meeting, and no aides, no paper trail, just two men sitting across from each other behind a closed door, one defending the bench, the other living through a storm. The conversation never leaked. But the next day, Boasburg announced he would be taking an extended leave of absence to ensure the integrity of ongoing proceedings is not compromised. Bondi called a press conference 2 hours later. "This is not a victory," she said. "It's a warning." But not everyone saw it that way. And for Roberts, the damage was already done. John Roberts didn't sleep the night Boasburg stepped down, not because he regretted the meeting but because of what it meant. He'd spent his entire career trying to keep the court above the noisy, above politics, above pressure. But now the walls were thinner, the public could see straight through, and they were watching. He sat alone in his office at dawn, reading the headlines. Boasburg steps aside after Bondi's campaign. Is the judiciary cracking? Roberts waited. No more. But too late. The Supreme Court was supposed to be the last calm in the storm. Now it was part of it. Across the city, Pam Bondi's office was already buzzing. Her team had compiled a list of judges flagged in the last 2 years for alleged procedural overreach. She hadn't said it out loud yet, but she was thinking it. Boasburg wouldn't be the last. Her communications director walked in with a stack of messages. Support's climbing, he said. We're getting emails from district attorneys, sheriffs, even a couple of appellate clerks. Any heat? Plenty. Threats. Letters from law professors. ABA is drafting a formal condemnation. Bondi didn't flinch. Let them. But behind closed doors, there was tension. Some inside her own circle had begun to worry she was pressing too hard, moving too fast. One advisor asked her that afternoon, "What if they call your bluff?" She stared at him for a second. They already did, and they lost. In Flagstaff, Arizona, a federal magistrate named Harold Cade watched the coverage over lunch. He'd been on the bench 32 years, never made a headline in his life. Now he wasn't so sure that was a good thing. He pushed his tray away and muttered, "We're not supposed to be famous." "That's the job." His clerk, sitting across from him, kept her voice low. "Do you think they'll come after more of us?" Cade didn't answer right away. "I think they've figured out judges don't hit back." Meanwhile, Roberts called a second emergency judicial council not to talk but to listen. He wanted to hear from the ground up. Dozens of judges from across the country sent written statements, audio recordings, private memos. Some begged for unity. Others warned that staying quiet had made them look arrogant. But one message stood out. It came from a recently retired district judge in Kansas named Ron Ju Kellerman. Her note read, "You can't win a PR war with robes and silence. If we want the public to believe in the courts again, they need to see our struggling, not just our rulings." Roberts read it 3 times. Then, for the first time in months, he drafted something long-form, a speech he would deliver in front of the American Bar Association. Undevised, unfiltered, just judges, lawyers, and words that mattered. He took the stage 2 weeks later in Minneapolis. The room was packed. He didn't bother with small talk. "I've been asked why I didn't respond sooner. The truth is, I hoped it would pass, but it hasn't, and maybe it shouldn't." He paused, scanning the room. "When judges lose the trust of the people, we lose more than our legitimacy. We lose our purpose." Judicial independence is not a shield from criticism. It's a promise of discipline. And when we break that promise, we deserve scrutiny. There were no cameras, no applause, just quiet nods and the sound of pens scribbling. Back in Washington, Bondi watched a grainy live stream from her tablet. It wasn't a takedown. It wasn't a victory lap. It was something else. She closed the screen and whispered to no one. He finally showed up. Later that day, she met privately with several state attorneys general. She didn't pitch policy. She didn't wave a flag. She asked a question. What happens when the law forgets who it's for? They didn't answer, not right away, but it stayed with them. By late spring, Boasburg's name had faded from the news cycle. He hadn't resigned outright, but it didn't matter. His career had changed forever. His rulings would always carry the shadow of this moment. Roberts, too, had changed. He began attending more public legal forums, not to defend the court but to explain it, to remind people that justice wasn't just a word but a weight carried by people fallible and afraid.